Oh my God, what's happening?
Imagine waking up one Tuesday morning, at 68 years old, after 40 years of marriage, and the first thing you reach for is your phone to check the bank account. Not because you're suspicious, not because anything has felt wrong, but because a letter arrived the day before from a bank you barely recognized, and something in your gut told you not to wait until morning. And when that screen loads, and you see the number sitting there in the balance column, $214.03, you don't scream. You don't cry. You just sit there in the kitchen, in your robe, with your coffee going cold, because your brain simply cannot process what your eyes are telling it. That is where Margaret's story begins. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with the kind of moment you'd recognize from a movie. It begins with a number on a screen. $214. That is all that was left of 40 years. And the man who had taken everything, the man who had slept in the same bed, sat at the same table, shared the same name, he was already gone. He had been planning his exit for 7 years. And not once, in 7 years, had Margaret seen it coming. Not once had she imagined that the person she trusted with her life had been quietly, methodically, and legally dismantling everything she thought they had built together. Not once had she looked across the dinner table and thought, this man is building a life without me. But here is the part of this story that changes everything. Here is the part that Richard Calloway, that is what we are calling him, never counted on. Because while he was very careful about what he took, he was not careful about what he left behind. And what he left behind, in a box of old papers he considered worthless, was a single document. A property deed. For a house Margaret had never seen, in a town she had barely heard of, left to her specifically by her name by a woman who had been dead for 2 years. A woman the family had written off decades ago. A woman named Eleanor Voss. And that house, that quiet, gray, weather-worn house sitting at the end of a dirt road in Culpeper, Virginia, would not just save Margaret Calloway's life. It would open a door to a secret that had been buried in her own family for 60 years. A secret so carefully kept that not even Margaret's mother had told her the full truth. A secret that would connect Margaret to a man she had never met, a child who had been given away, and a woman who had spent her entire adult life making sure that when the worst came, and she believed the worst would come, there would be something left standing for the woman who needed it most. Stay with us, because this story is 90 minutes long, and every single minute of it matters. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what we are about to walk through together is not a simple story. It is a story about trust and betrayal, and the kind of love that does not announce itself, the kind that works quietly, for decades, in the background, making sure someone else will be okay. This is Margaret's story, and it begins, as all the most important stories do, long before the moment that changed everything. Let us go back. Not to the morning she found that bank statement. Not yet. Let us go back further, to the years before the silence, before the secrets, before the 7-year plan that Richard had built in the dark. Because to understand what Margaret lost on that Tuesday morning in December of 2019, you have to understand what she had spent 40 years building. You have to understand who she was before she became the woman sitting in a cold kitchen with $214 and an eviction notice that hadn't arrived yet. You have to understand where she came from, who she loved, and why, of all the people in her family, a woman she barely remembered had chosen her, had always chosen her. There are 3 questions at the center of this story, and I want to lay them out for you right now, not to answer them, but so that you understand what we are really talking about as we move through the next hour and a half. 3 questions that are simple on the surface and deeply complicated the moment you start pulling at them. The first question is this: how does a man hide an entire second financial life from his wife for 7 years right under her roof, at the same kitchen table, while sharing the same last name, and never get caught? Not a hint, not a slip, not a single moment where Margaret looked across the room and thought something is wrong here. 7 years of shell companies, secret accounts, transferred savings, fraudulent loans, and a one-way plane ticket that he had researched and booked 11 months before he used it. 7 years of looking his wife in the eye every single morning and saying nothing. How does a person do that? And more importantly, what does it tell us about the way financial abuse operates inside a long marriage? Because what Richard did to Margaret was not unusual. According to legal and financial professionals who work in this field, the pattern he followed, the gradual draining, the hidden entities, the strategic timing, is a playbook that has been used in divorces across this country for decades. Margaret was not the first. She will not be the last. But she may be one of the few whose story ended the way it did. The second question is this: who was Eleanor Voss? Not in the sense of her name, her occupation, her date of birth. We can tell you those things easily. Eleanor was born in Richmond, Virginia, in 1931. She worked as a legal secretary at a downtown law firm for 35 years. She never married. She never had children, at least, not officially, not in any record that the family ever acknowledged. She died in October of 2017 at 86 years old, in a small care facility outside of Charlottesville. She was quiet, private, largely unremarkable to anyone who did not know her well. But the real question about Eleanor Voss is not who she was in the public record. The real question is what she knew, what she had been carrying, in silence, for 6 decades. Why she purchased a property in Culpeper, Virginia, in 1961, and why she paid the taxes on that property every single year until the day she died, not for herself, but for a woman she barely knew, who was still a young girl when Eleanor made her first payment. And why she wrote a will in 2003, 14 years before her death, naming Margaret and Calloway as the sole inheritor of that property. Not Margaret's mother, not Margaret's sister, Margaret, by name, with a sealed letter inside the house that had been sitting on a kitchen table, waiting, for 2 years. And the third question, the one that will not leave you alone once this story is over, is this: what does it mean that a woman who was cut off, erased, written out of the family story, spent 60 years protecting a woman in a family that had rejected her? What does it say about Eleanor that her response to being silenced was not bitterness, not legal action, not revenge, but a quiet, long, patient act of provision? What does it say about the people who erased her? And what does it say about the kind of love that works in the background, unseen, unacknowledged, for decades, the kind that never asks to be recognized and never stops working anyway? Those are the 3 questions. Hold them, because every part of this story is an answer to one of them. And by the time we reach the end, you are going to understand why Eleanor Voss is just as central to this story as the woman whose name is in the title. Now let us set the scene. The year is 2019. The place is Fredericksburg, Virginia, a mid-sized city about an hour south of Washington, D.C., the kind of place where old neighborhoods sit next to new subdivisions, where churches are full on Sunday mornings, where people have lived in the same houses for decades, and where neighbors still, sometimes, know each other's names. Margaret and Richard Calloway had lived in Fredericksburg for 31 years. Their house on Devereaux Lane was a 3-bedroom colonial with a front porch and a yard she had planted herself, starting in 1989, with hydrangeas that were still blooming every June. Their children had grown up in that house. Their holidays had happened in that kitchen. And in December of 2019, a bank that Margaret had never done business with had a legal claim to all of it. Before we walk through what happened on the morning of December 9th, the morning Richard was gone, we need to understand who these people were. Because the story that the numbers tell and the story that the years tell are not always the same story. And the distance between them is where everything actually happened. Margaret in Whitfield was born in 1951 in Richmond, Virginia, the second of 4 children raised in a working-class household by a father who worked at the Reynolds Metals plant and a mother who cleaned houses 3 days a week and kept the other 4 days for her own family. Money was never plentiful in that house. It was managed, carefully, quietly, with the kind of discipline that comes from watching your parents count change before the grocery run. Margaret grew up understanding that security was not something that arrived on its own. It was something you built, brick by brick, decision by decision, over years of showing up and doing the work without complaint. She was a good student. Not the kind of student who glides through on natural ability, the kind who stays up late, rewrites her notes, and reads the chapter twice. She had a particular talent for numbers, which was perhaps ironic given everything that would happen later. After high school, she took a 2-year bookkeeping course at a local community college and went to work for a small accounting firm in Richmond. She was 23 years old and saving money for the first time in her life with the specific, deliberate intention of saving it. Not because someone told her to, because she had grown up watching what happened when there was nothing in reserve, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that she would never live that way. She met Richard Calloway at a church social in the fall of 1978. He was 29 years old, recently arrived in Richmond from a small town in southwestern Virginia, confident in the loose and easy way of someone who had never been told no too many times. He was charming without effort. He had a plan he was always talking about, which at the time involved getting into real estate, because he had a cousin who had made good money in property sales, and Richard firmly believed that he had the same instincts, maybe better. He had big ideas. He talked about them constantly. And Margaret, who was disciplined and careful and a little bit cautious by nature, found herself drawn to someone who seemed to feel no fear at all about the future. They married in March of 1979. Margaret was 28. Richard was 30. Her parents liked him well enough her father shook his hand firmly at the wedding and told him to take care of his daughter, and Richard said he would. For years, Margaret believed that he meant it. The early years of their marriage were ordinary in the way that most people's early years are ordinary, full of small pressures, small joys, arguments about money and time, and whose family they were spending the holidays with. Richard started his real estate business in 1982. For the first few years, it went reasonably well. The Richmond housing market was active in the mid-'80s, and Richard had enough personality to close a sale. They bought their house in Fredericksburg in 1988. Their son David was born in 1980. Their daughter Susan came in 1983. By the time they moved into the house on Devereux Lane, they looked, from the outside, like exactly what they were supposed to be, a working American family, building something together. Margaret had left the accounting firm when David was born and taken a part-time bookkeeping position with a Methodist church in Fredericksburg, a job that paid modestly but offered flexibility and a community she genuinely loved. She kept that job for 22 years. And during those 22 years, she managed the household finances, the grocery budget, the children's school costs, the insurance premiums, the utility bills while Richard managed, as he put it, the business side of things. The business accounts, the taxes, the investment decisions. Margaret did not question this division. It was what she knew. It was how she had seen her own parents operate, in their own way. One person handled the public money, the other handled the household. She trusted him with it. In 22 years, she never had a reason to believe that trust was misplaced. That is the detail that matters most in this part of the story. Not the money, not the real estate business, the trust. Margaret had constructed her entire financial understanding of their marriage on a foundation of complete, unexamined trust. She did not know the details of his accounts. She did not know the names of the companies he had formed over the years because he had formed several, some successful, some not. She did not know what the balance was in the business checking account, or what properties he had bought and sold, or whether there were debts she did not know about. She knew what he chose to tell her. And for 20 years, what he chose to tell her was enough. It was not complete, but it was enough. The cracks, when they came slowly. In the 90s, Richard's real estate business went through two difficult stretches. The early 90s recession hit Virginia's property market hard, and Richard spent several years working harder for smaller returns. Margaret covered more of the household costs during those years, quietly and without making it a point of conflict. The business recovered. Things smoothed out again. In the early 2000s, he shifted toward commercial property, small office spaces, strip mall units, the kind of mid-level commercial real estate that was reliable, if not spectacular. He made decent money. They were comfortable. Not wealthy. Comfortable. And then, somewhere around 2012, something shifted. Margaret could not have named it at the time. She might describe it now as a change in his energy, a new restlessness, an impatience she had not seen before, a tendency to take phone calls in the driveway rather than at the kitchen table. She noticed it the way you notice a slightly different smell in a room, not alarming, just slightly off. Not enough to investigate. Not enough to ask about. Just enough to file away in some quiet part of your mind and tell yourself it probably means nothing. It meant something. In 2012, Richard Calloway filed the paperwork to form a limited liability company in the state of Delaware. This is not, by itself, an unusual or illegal act. Delaware is well known as a state with particularly business-friendly laws, and thousands of small business owners form LLCs there every year for entirely legitimate reasons. What made Richard's LLC different was its purpose. It was not formed to conduct new business. It was formed as a vehicle, a container, essentially into which he could move money without Margaret's knowledge. The company had no real operations, no employees, no clients, no invoices. It existed on paper. And into that paper company, over the course of 7 years, Richard moved a significant portion of what he and Margaret had built together. According to forensic accounting professionals who have examined similar cases, the pattern Richard used was far from rare. Attorneys who specialize in financial abuse and divorce proceedings have documented this approach repeatedly. A spouse, typically the one who controls the business finances, begins quietly routing small amounts of money through entities that the other spouse has no knowledge of or access to. The amounts are kept deliberately below the thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting. A few thousand here, a transfer there, a business expense that was never really a business expense. Over months, it becomes a routine. Over the years, it became architecture. By the time the other spouse finds out, the money has been moved so many times, through so many different accounts, that tracing it requires a forensic accountant, a willing attorney, and a court order, none of which are cheap, and none of which are fast. Richard also did something else that was both calculated and cruel. In 2017, he applied for a home equity line of credit on the house on Devereux Lane. He used Margaret's name, her social security number, and her signature, a signature that she has never been able to fully account for, though her attorney later argued that it may have been forged on the documents. The line of credit was for $180,000. He drew it down to nearly its full limit over the course of 18 months. He never told Margaret it existed. He never made a single payment. And the clock on the foreclosure process began ticking the moment he stopped making those payments, which was 3 months before he left. By December 2019, Richard Calloway had transferred approximately $340,000 out of their shared financial life. He had secured a condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the name of his Delaware LLC. He had a flight booked. He had a girlfriend named Diane, a woman he had been seeing for 4 years, who, investigators would later confirm, had no knowledge of the financial scheme and was as blindsided by his methods as Margaret was. He had resigned from his commercial real estate brokerage 2 weeks earlier without telling his wife. And on the night of December 8, 2019, he packed 2 bags specifically, only 2 bags, carefully selected, because he did not want the missing clothes to be obvious too quickly, and he left. He was gone before Margaret woke up. And the house, the marriage, the 40 years, all of it went with him. Now let us talk about Eleanor Voss. Because while Richard was building his exit strategy in the background, Eleanor had been doing something else entirely. She had been, for 60 years, building a safety net for a woman she had watched from a distance. A woman she had chosen, deliberately and specifically, for reasons that would not become clear until Margaret was standing in a house she had never seen before, holding a letter she had never expected to find. Eleanor Voss was born in Richmond in 1931, the same city where Margaret would be born 20 years later. She was a quiet woman, not shy, not withdrawn, but quiet in the way of someone who has learned that the world does not always reward people who speak first. She graduated from high school in 1949, took a secretarial course, and found work at a Richmond law firm where she would remain for the next 3.5 decades. She was, by all accounts, exceptionally competent, meticulous, organized, discreet. The partners trusted her with the kind of sensitive documents you only entrust to someone you are certain will not talk. She did not talk. She never married. When family members, the ones she still had contact with, which was not many by the 1970s, asked about it, she would say simply that she had not found the right arrangement. She did not elaborate. She had learned, early in her adult life, that there were things about herself that the people around her were not ready to understand, and she had made her peace with the decision to keep those things private. What she had not made her peace with, and what she would carry for the rest of her life, was what had happened in 1961. What had happened between her and Margaret's grandfather, William Whitfield, and the choice that had been made, or rather, forced in the aftermath of what that relationship produced. We will come to that, but not yet. Because to understand the weight of what Eleanor did for Margaret, you first have to understand what it cost her. And to understand what it cost her, you first need to sit with the fact that Eleanor Voss paid property taxes on a house in Culpeper, Virginia, every single year for 56 years. Not for herself. She never lived there. She visited once, in 1987, to close the property up properly and ensure it would hold through the years. And then she left. And she kept paying. Year after year. Decade after decade. Until the day she died. The house was purchased in 1961 for $11,000. At the time of Eleanor's death in 2017, it was assessed at $164,000. She had never tried to sell it. Never rented it out. Never listed it. She had simply maintained it, paying the taxes, keeping the insurance current, making sure the deed remained clean and in her name, so that when the time came to transfer it, there would be nothing blocking the way. She wrote her will in 2003. Margaret was 52 years old, still working at the church, still married to Richard, with no reason to believe that anything was wrong. Eleanor wrote Margaret's name into that will from 400 miles away, based on a knowledge of that family's patterns that ran deeper than geography. She left a sealed letter inside the house addressed specifically to Margaret, and then she waited. She lived another 14 years. She never reached out. She never told anyone what she had done. She just waited and paid and kept the deed clean. And in October 2017, Eleanor Voss died in the care facility outside Charlottesville, quiet and private to the last. The letter sat on the kitchen table in Culpeper for 2 years before anyone went to get it. Looking back, Margaret will tell you that the signs were there. She will say this carefully, the way people say things they have had a long time to think about, not with self-blame, but with the particular clarity that comes from having understood something fully only after it was over. She will tell you that there were moments, across the last 2 or 3 years of their marriage, that she noticed and then quietly set aside. Not because she was naive, not because she was incurious, but because when you have trusted someone for 4 decades, the threshold for alarm is not where it would be with a stranger. The threshold is much, much higher. And Richard knew that. He had been counting on it. In the fall of 2019, a few months before he left, Richard had started sleeping in the guest room. He told her it was his back, that her side of the bed was too soft now, that he needed the firmer mattress in the spare room to get through the night without pain. She did not question this. He was 60 years old. Back problems were not an unusual thing. She brought him ibuprofen and a heating pad and thought nothing more of it. She did not know that sleeping in the guest room also meant he could leave the house at 3 in the morning without disturbing her. She did not know he had been doing exactly that. In October, he gave their son David his grandfather's watch, a Hamilton khaki that had been in the Calloway family for 50 years, the kind of watch that gets handed down at a retirement or a milestone birthday. Richard told David he was simplifying, clearing out things he did not need anymore. David took the watch with some surprise and asked if everything was all right. Richard told him everything was fine. He smiled when he said it. David later said it was the most convincing smile he had ever seen from his father. He did not push. In November, Richard canceled a vacation he and Margaret had planned for January, a 2-week trip to Savannah and the coastal Georgia islands that she had been looking forward to for months. He said business was uncertain and he did not want to commit the money. She was disappointed. She did not argue. She had spent 40 years accommodating the rhythms of a man who was always managing something just outside her view, and she had learned, long ago, that pushing on those moments rarely produced useful information. She told herself they would reschedule in the spring. And then, on the Wednesday morning 1 week before he left, he walked into the kitchen where she was having her first cup of coffee, and he said, quietly, without drama, "I love you, Maggie." That was what he had always called her. Maggie. She looked up from her coffee, and she said it back. He went to work. Or he said he was going to work. She does not know now where he actually went. She knows that was the last time he spoke to her. She knows that those 3 words, "I love you, Maggie," were the final thing her husband of 40 years chose to say to her before disappearing from her life entirely. She has thought about that more times than she can count. She does not know what to do with it. December 9th, 2019. A Tuesday. Margaret Calloway woke at 6:15 in the morning, as she always did. She noticed, as she passed the hallway, that the guest room door was open and the bed already made. She assumed Richard had gotten up early. He sometimes did that when he had early appointments or paperwork to catch up on. She went downstairs. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and her notepad. She kept a paper to-do list, always had, and she went through the mail that had come the day before, which she had set aside unopened. The letter from First National Bank was in a plain white envelope. Standard business correspondence. Margaret opened it without any particular feeling of dread. The letter informed her, in formal and impersonal language, that the home equity line of credit on the property at her Fredericksburg address had missed 2 consecutive payments, and that the account was now in default. It provided a phone number and an address for the collections department. It was signed by a vice president of customer services whose name she did not recognize. Margaret read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she put it down on the table and sat very still for a moment, because the sentence that would not leave her mind was not about the missed payments. It was the phrase home equity line of credit, because she had not known that phrase applied to her house. She had not known there was a home equity line of credit. She had not known there was an account with First National Bank at all. She picked up her phone and called Richard's cell. The number was disconnected, not temporarily unavailable. Disconnected. She called again. She got the same automated message. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time, looking at the wall. Then she called his office, the commercial real estate brokerage where he had worked for 11 years. The receptionist answered and told her, in a voice that carried the careful awkwardness of someone delivering information they had been told not to discuss, that Richard was no longer with the firm. He had resigned approximately 2 weeks prior. They had been told he was pursuing other opportunities. They were sorry they could not provide more information. Margaret thanked her and hung up. She went upstairs to the guest room. She looked in the closet. Half his clothes were gone. Not all of them. He had been careful about that too, leaving enough behind to make the absence less immediately obvious. But the suits were gone. The good shoes were gone. The travel bag that he kept on the top shelf was gone. She went to the bathroom. His razor was gone. His cologne was gone. The prescription medications he kept in the cabinet were gone. She stood in the bathroom doorway for a moment, and then she went back downstairs to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and opened the banking app on her phone for the first time she could remember doing so on her own. Balance, $214.03. She did not move from that chair for 3 hours. She sat there with the coffee getting cold and the morning getting brighter through the windows, and she kept waiting. She said later, for the moment where it would make sense. For the explanation that would make the pieces add up to something she could understand. It did not come, because there was no explanation that made this make sense. There was only the number on the phone screen, the empty half of a closet upstairs, and the growing understanding that the man she had been married to for 40 years had not been who she thought he was. Had perhaps not been that person for quite some time. She called her daughter Susan at 10 in the morning. The call went to voicemail. She left a message that she later described as remarkably calm. She simply said she needed to talk, that something had happened, and that she would appreciate a call back as soon as possible. She did not say what. She sat back down at the table. She did not call her son David yet. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call anyone else. She sat in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 31 years, and she tried, very hard, to understand what had just happened to her life. 3 days later, the attorney's letter arrived. It informed her, in language that was precise and unambiguous, that the foreclosure process on the Devereux Lane property had been initiated. She had 72 hours to vacate the premises before the proceedings moved to the next stage. 72 hours to leave the house where her children had grown up. 72 hours to pack whatever she could carry and find somewhere to go. Her son David flew in from Denver the following morning. He had taken the first available flight after Margaret, finally, called him. He arrived at the house looking like a man who had not slept on the plane and had spent the entire flight trying to hold himself together. He hugged his mother in the front hallway for a long time and did not say anything at first, which was exactly right. Then they sat down together at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had been sitting when the bank letter arrived, and they started going through the papers. David had already been in contact with a family law attorney in Virginia. The attorney's assessment was painful but clear. The fraud was real. The transfers were traceable. Richard had broken the law in several distinct and documented ways. But the legal process to pursue him, to recover the assets, to contest the foreclosure, that process would take months at minimum, more likely more than a year. In the immediate term, Margaret could not stay in the house. The bank had a legitimate legal claim to it, regardless of how that claim had been established. There was no quick remedy. The house on Devereux Lane was gone. It was while they were going through the boxes that Richard had left behind cardboard boxes in the basement, full of what appeared to be old business documents, warranties, expired insurance policies, receipts from the 90s, the kind of accumulated paper that every house has and nobody ever looks at. That David found the envelope from the probate court. Margaret's name on the front. An estate notification. A property deed enclosed for a parcel of land in Culpeper County, Virginia. Sole inheritor, Margaret and Calloway. From the estate of Eleanor Rose Voss. Dated 2017. 2 years old. Unopened, apparently, because Richard had seen it and set it aside, probably believing it was not important. Probably not imagining that the woman he had just left with $214 had a house waiting for her 2 hours away. David brought the envelope upstairs and set it on the kitchen table in front of his mother. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at her son and said, "I know where this is. Not I know what this is. Not I know who Eleanor Voss was. Just, I know where this is." She said it the way a person says something when a memory surfaces suddenly, unexpectedly, from a long time ago. Something her mother had mentioned once, long ago. A town name. A road. She did not know how she knew it. But she knew. She packed everything she owned into the back of her 2014 Honda Accord. 2 suitcases, 4 cardboard boxes, a bag of kitchen things her son made her take even though she said she did not need them. David offered to drive her. She told him no. He offered to follow behind her. She told him no again. She told him she needed to do this herself. He stood in the driveway of the house on Devereaux Lane and watched his 68-year-old mother pull out of a driveway she would never come back to, heading for a place she had never been, to a house she had never seen, on a deed she had not known existed until 48 hours ago. He said later that watching her go was one of the hardest things he had ever witnessed. She did not look back. She drove 2 hours through Virginia in December. The interstate to Culpeper is not a scenic road. It is a working road. Trucks, commuters, the kind of gray interstate that exists to move people from one place to another without asking them to look too closely at what they are passing. Margaret drove without the radio on. She did not listen to music. She did not call anyone. She drove the way people drive when they are still in a kind of shock that has not yet fully resolved into grief, mechanically, attentively, and with a very small part of their mind that keeps wondering if any of this is actually real. She took the exit for Culpeper at just past noon. She followed the directions on her phone through the town and then out the other side, past the gas stations and the fast food places, past the older neighborhoods near the main road, and down a series of progressively smaller roads that eventually became one lane and then became gravel. The mailbox at the end of the driveway had no name on it, just a number. The driveway was longer than she expected, lined with trees that in December were bare and gray against the sky, their branches interlocked overhead like fingers laced together. She drove slowly, and then the house came into view around a bend in the driveway, and she stopped the car and sat there for a moment before she got out. It was small, 2 stories, white clapboard that had gone gray from years of weather and no fresh paint. The front porch had 2 boards missing, and one of the porch railings had separated from its post and was hanging at an angle. The bushes on either side of the front steps had grown into each other and were well past the windows. A rusted metal glider sat on the porch, its paint the color of old blood. The yard was wild with the kind of growth that happens when nothing is tended for years at a time. But the roof looked solid. The chimney was intact. The windows, every one of them, were intact. The house was weathered. It was not broken. The key the estate attorney had mailed her worked on the first try. The deadbolt turned cleanly. The door swung open, and the smell that came out, cedar, old paper, closed in air, the faint trace of something that might have been wood smoke from decades ago, was not the smell of abandonment, exactly. It was the smell of waiting, like a room that had been expecting someone and had simply been very patient about it. The furniture was still there. A sofa covered with a white sheet, an armchair, a bookcase with rows of paperback novels, their spines faded, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a cast iron pan hanging on the wall above the stove, a calendar on the wall beside the back door, still showing March 1987, the month Eleanor had last been here, the month she had closed the house up and driven away and not come back. A photograph on the mantel above the fireplace, a woman in her 30s or 40s, unsmiling but not unhappy, standing in front of what appeared to be the house itself, taken from the driveway, in summer, when the trees behind her were full and green. Margaret did not recognize the woman. She would not, for several weeks, come to understand with certainty who the woman in that photograph was. But she stood in front of it for a long time anyway, looking at the face. Something about it felt familiar. Not the features, the expression. the particular expression of someone who is very accustomed to keeping their own counsel. And then she saw the envelope on the kitchen table. It was a plain white envelope, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. Her name was written on the front in a handwriting she did not recognize, a careful, deliberate cursive, the kind taught in Virginia schoolrooms in the 1940s. Margaret and Calloway. The full name. Not Maggie. Not Margaret Calloway. Margaret and Calloway. Like an official document. Like a summons. Like something that had been placed with intention. She stood in the kitchen in her coat, with her car keys still in her hand, and she looked at the envelope for a long time before she picked it up. She could not have said afterward how long she stood there. Long enough for the light to shift slightly. Long enough for the silence of the house to become something she was aware of in her body, not just her ears. Then she sat down in one of the two chairs at the kitchen table, set her keys down beside her, and opened the envelope. We will come back to what she found inside. We will come to it. But first, we need to talk about what was happening simultaneously, 2 hours away and several hundred miles further south, because the legal machinery of what Richard Calloway had done had also started moving. Richard Calloway had been in Scottsdale, Arizona, for less than 72 hours when his attorney filed for divorce on his behalf. This is worth pausing on, because it tells you something important about how Richard understood what he had done. He did not go into hiding. He did not change his name. He did not attempt to make himself difficult to find. He checked into the condo that his Delaware LLC had purchased the previous year. He called the attorney he had retained 6 months in advance of his departure, and he initiated the legal process of ending his marriage before Margaret had even stopped sitting at the kitchen table trying to understand where her life had gone. He believed, apparently, that what he had done was legal, or legal enough, or at least difficult enough to prosecute that the outcome would be manageable. He was partially right about the difficulty. The forensic accountant that David retained, a woman based in Richmond who specialized in matrimonial fraud cases, spent 4 months tracing the money through 11 different accounts across 3 states. The Delaware LLC had been dissolved the same week Richard left, a planned move that complicated the asset recovery process significantly. But the transfers had not been perfectly hidden. Bank records go back 7 years in most states, and those 7 years of records told a story that a skilled forensic accountant could follow. According to published information on similar cases from family law attorneys who have dealt with precisely this pattern, men who use LLCs to hide marital assets often make one common mistake. They believe the complexity of the structure will be enough to discourage investigation. It rarely is, when the other spouse has both the will and the legal support to pursue it. The investigators traced the bulk of the transferred money to a combination of the Arizona condo, held in the LLC's name, and a series of accounts in Richard's name that had been opened at banks in states where he had no prior financial history. The total amount moved over 7 years was traced to approximately $340,000. Not all of it was recoverable. Some of it had been spent. Some of it was tied up in the condo in ways that required a court order to unwind. But the paper trail was clear enough that when the case went before a Virginia judge, the picture of what Richard had done was not ambiguous. Richard's attorney argued, predictably, that the LLC was a legitimate business entity and that the transfers represented normal business activity. The forensic accountant's testimony dismantled that argument methodically. The LLC had no operations, no clients, no income. It existed, she demonstrated to the court's satisfaction, for the sole purpose of moving marital assets out of reach. The home equity line of credit, the one in Margaret's name, was a more complicated matter, because proving that Margaret's signature had been forged required a handwriting analysis that took several months to complete. The analysis ultimately supported the forgery claim. Richard denied it. The court did not find his denial credible. But none of this was fast, and none of it was free. While the legal case ground forward at the pace that legal cases grind, Margaret was living in the house in Culpeper, and the complications did not stop at the courtroom door. The first complication was Richard's girlfriend, Diane. In the early weeks after Richard left, there were people who suggested including, briefly, the private investigator that David had retained that Diane might have been aware of or even involved in the financial planning. She was not. Diane was a 44-year-old woman from Phoenix who had met Richard at a real estate conference in 2015 and had believed, for 4 years, that he was in the process of separating from his wife. She did not know the full extent of what he had done. When investigators contacted her, she cooperated fully. She was not charged with anything. She was, by multiple accounts, almost as angry as Margaret, though for different reasons. She did not stay with Richard after the full picture emerged. This was, under the circumstances, one of the less surprising outcomes of the investigation. The second complication was Eleanor's nephew, Carl Voss. Carl was 61 years old, a real estate agent based in Virginia Beach, Eleanor's closest living male relative, and a man who had expected, with what he clearly felt was reasonable confidence, to inherit the Culpeper property when Eleanor died. He had not known about the will. Or rather, he had known a will existed, but had not been provided with a copy until the estate was formally opened following Eleanor's death. When he learned that the property had gone to Margaret, a woman he knew only as a distant relative by marriage, not even by blood, he retained an attorney and contested the bequest, arguing that Eleanor had lacked the mental capacity to make a valid will at the time she wrote it in 2003. The mental incapacity argument failed quickly. Eleanor Voss had written her will in the office of a licensed Virginia attorney who had known her for 20 years. The attorney testified that Eleanor had been fully competent at the time of the will's execution, precise, calm, clear about her intentions, and explicit about her reasons, though those reasons were communicated privately to the attorney and not entered into the public record. The will was upheld without modification. Carl Voss's challenge was dismissed by the court within 6 weeks. But 6 weeks in the legal system costs money. Carl's challenge had required Margaret to retain a probate attorney, respond to filings, attend a hearing, and produce documentation supporting the will's validity. The total legal cost to Margaret of Carl's unsuccessful challenge was approximately $10,000. She did not have $10,000. She borrowed it from David. She paid him back. Eventually, after the divorce settlement came through. But in the months when she was living in the Culpeper house on what remained of her small savings and a modest church pension, she had nearly forgotten she had. $10,000 was not an insignificant sum. The third complication was the one that turned out to matter the most. And it began not with a legal filing, but with a box in the basement. David came down to Culpeper in February, about 2 months after Margaret had moved in, to help her with some of the more physical work that the house needed: the missing porch boards, some gutter repairs, a basement door that had warped and would not close properly. While he was working on the basement, moving boxes to get to the door frame, he noticed something about one section of the far basement wall. The paneling did not sit flush. There was a gap at the bottom, small, maybe half an inch, and when he pressed the panel at the corner, it gave. Not like a secret door in a movie. Like a panel that had been removed and replaced many times and no longer held perfectly tight. He pulled it loose. Behind it was a space roughly 2 feet deep by 4 feet wide, lined with cedar boards, dry and clean. And in that space were 4 cardboard boxes, sealed with tape that had dried and cracked but held, each one labeled in Eleanor's precise cursive handwriting. Documents. Do not discard. He called his mother downstairs. They stood together in the basement and looked at the 4 boxes for a moment before either of them moved. Then Margaret said, "Bring them upstairs." And they carried them up to the kitchen table, and they opened the first one. Let us go back to that first afternoon, to the envelope on the kitchen table, to Margaret, still in her coat, sitting in one of 2 chairs in a house that had been waiting for her for 2 years, opening a letter from a woman she barely remembered, who had been dead since October 2017. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on cream-colored stationery. Eleanor had written it in 2016, a year before her death, when she knew her health was failing and she wanted to ensure that the words would be clear and complete. Her handwriting was the careful, upright cursive of someone who had spent decades writing documents that other people depended on. It did not waver. It did not rush. It said what it needed to say. Eleanor began by addressing the practical matter. First, the house was Margaret's. The deed was clean. There were no liens, no debts, no complications attached to the property. She had made sure of that. She had maintained it specifically so that it would be a clean transfer, nothing owed, nothing contested, nothing standing in the way. Then she wrote, and Margaret has shared parts of this letter publicly, though not all of it, that she had watched Margaret's life from a distance for many years, that she had believed for a long time that the house might one day be needed, and that she was glad to know it would go to someone who would understand what it meant to be given something when you had nothing left. Then Eleanor came to the part of the letter that stopped Margaret completely. She wrote that the house had not been purchased for herself. She had never intended to live in it. It had been purchased as a response to a decision made in 1961, a decision Eleanor had no power to prevent, but that she had spent her life responding to in the only way she could. She wrote that Margaret's grandmother had made a choice that year that had cost Eleanor everything she had at the time. And she wrote that she did not blame Margaret's grandmother, or rather, that she had tried not to for a long time, and had eventually arrived at something closer to understanding than blame, which was the best she could manage. And she wrote that she hoped Margaret would one day understand that the house was not given out of guilt or obligation. It was given out of love. The particular kind of love, she wrote, that learns to express itself quietly, because the louder expressions have been taken away. Margaret set the letter down after the third page. She sat in the kitchen of the house for a long time. She did not cry. Not yet. She looked around the room at the cast-iron pan on the wall, at the March 1987 calendar, at the photograph on the mantel of the woman she did not yet fully recognize. And she thought about what Eleanor had meant by the decision made in 1961. She did not know the full story yet. She knew only the outline, the vague shape of something her mother had mentioned once, when Margaret was a teenager, in a tone that made clear it was not something to be discussed further. She had not pushed. She had filed it away in the part of her memory where things go when the adults in your life have made clear that asking more questions is not welcome. Now, in this house, with this letter, she needed the rest of the story. She found it in the 4 boxes from the basement. Eleanor Voss had kept everything. This is a characteristic of certain people who have been required by circumstance to live very privately. They document. They preserve. Because they understand that the world has a way of rewriting the stories of people who are not in a position to defend their own version. Eleanor had understood this from an early age, and she had spent 50 years creating an archive that would make her version impossible to erase. The boxes contained 4 decades of correspondence. Letters she had written and never sent. Letters she had received and kept. Legal documents. Photographs. A journal, kept sporadically from 1958 through the early 1980s, written in a smaller hand than her letters, more intimate and more unguarded. And at the top of the first box, as if placed there deliberately, which it was a single sealed envelope labeled, "For Margaret," after the letter. Inside that second envelope was a document that Eleanor had drawn up by her attorney in 1999, a summary, written for clarity rather than legal purpose, of the events of 1961 and their consequences. It was written in the third person, which Eleanor explained at the beginning of the document was because she had found it easier to understand what had happened when she was not the one standing inside it. She wrote, "I have spent many years trying to tell this story in the first person, and I have found that I cannot do it without becoming lost in what I felt. So I will tell it as if it happened to someone else, and we will both understand who that someone else was." In 1958, Eleanor Voss began a relationship with William Whitfield, a married man, 14 years her senior, who was at the time a prominent member of their church community in Richmond. William Whitfield was Margaret's maternal grandfather. He was, by all the accounts Eleanor preserved in her letters, not a bad man in any simple sense of the word. He was a man of his era, capable of genuine warmth, capable of real affection, and also capable of the particular self-deception that was required, in that time and place, to maintain a double life without acknowledging to himself what he was doing to the people in both of them. Eleanor had not known he was married when they first began spending time together. By the time she understood the full situation, she was already in love with him. She made her choices with her eyes open, she wrote, and she did not pretend otherwise. She was 27 years old. She had not yet learned all the ways that love can be used against you. In 1961, Eleanor became pregnant. This was not, in 1961, in Richmond, Virginia, a situation that had many manageable outcomes. William Whitfield's wife, Margaret's grandmother, Dorothy Whitfield, discovered the pregnancy. Dorothy was not a woman who could be described as understanding about this particular situation, and the account Eleanor preserved suggests that what followed was swift, decisive, and without any real negotiation. Eleanor was to give up the child. She was to have no further contact with William or any member of the Whitfield family. She was to make herself, in effect, invisible to all of them. In exchange, Dorothy agreed not to destroy Eleanor's reputation publicly, which, in 1961 would have meant the loss of her job, her standing in the community, and very possibly her ability to support herself at all. Eleanor accepted these terms. She did not have better ones available to her. The child, a boy, was born in late 1961. Eleanor held him for approximately 4 hours before a social worker came to take him. She described those 4 hours in her journal in language that Margaret has said she cannot bring herself to read more than once, because the grief in it is too precise. The child was placed for adoption. Eleanor was given no information about the family. She was told, in the manner of adoption proceedings of that era, that knowing would not help her. She did not agree with this assessment, but she had no power to change it. She bought the house in Culpeper 6 months later, with money she had saved over several years. She bought it in her name. She told no one what it was for. When asked, she said it was an investment property, which was technically true, in the sense that it was property she owned. She just never said what she was investing in. She was investing in the possibility that someday, someone in the family that had taken everything from her would need exactly the thing she had to give. She had thought, initially, that the house might be for herself, for the version of herself that might one day need to start over. But as the years passed and she settled into her quiet, private, self-sufficient life, she understood that she would not be the one who needed it. She had built a life that did not require rescue. What she had built required management and loneliness and the constant low discipline of keeping your own story from consuming you. But it was stable. She was stable. The house was for someone else. And as she watched, from her distance, the marriages in the Whitfield family, the patterns that repeated, the vulnerabilities that passed from one generation to the next, she became increasingly certain that she knew whose name belonged on the deed. She had watched Margaret's mother, who had grown up knowing something was wrong with her parents' marriage without ever being told exactly what. She had watched Margaret herself from a distance, not obsessively, not intrusively, but the way you watch a person whose story you understand better than they know you do. And what Eleanor saw, watching Margaret's marriage to Richard Calloway over the years, was a woman who had placed all of her financial trust in a man who handled the money in the same way William Whitfield had handled everything that was inconvenient, quietly, privately, behind a door he kept closed. She had written Margaret's name into the will in 2003. She had been watching for 23 years. And she had been right. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in Culpeper with those 4 boxes of documents spread around her, and she understood, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened. Not just to her, to Eleanor, to her grandmother, to the unnamed child who had been carried out of a Richmond hospital in the arms of a social worker in 1961 and placed into a life that Eleanor had never been permitted to know anything about. The legal resolution of the divorce case came 14 months later. In February 2021, a Virginia judge issued a civil judgment against Richard Calloway for marital asset fraud in the amount of $287,000. The Arizona condo, which had appreciated significantly since its purchase, was ordered sold and the proceeds divided. The Delaware LLC assets, to the extent they could be traced and recovered, were included in the settlement. After the legal fees, which were substantial, Margaret received approximately $193,000 over 18 months of payments. It was not the full amount of what had been taken. It never is. But it was something. And the judge's language in the written opinion was not mild. He described Richard Calloway's conduct as a sustained and deliberate effort to defraud his spouse over a period of years, which constituted one of the more egregious examples of marital financial abuse his court had encountered. Richard Calloway was never criminally charged. Financial abuse in marriage remains extraordinarily difficult to prosecute as a criminal matter in most American states. The civil judgment was enforceable, and Margaret's attorneys pursued it aggressively, but Richard's ability to delay payments through various legal maneuvers extended the process by months. He remained in Scottsdale throughout. He did not attend any of the hearings in person. He sent his attorney. Margaret, for her part, stayed in Culpeper and fixed the porch boards. It was March of 2021, 16 months after Margaret had driven alone down that gravel driveway with everything she owned in the back of a Honda Accord. She was living, by then, in the Culpeper house more comfortably than she had in those first cold December weeks. She had replaced the missing porch boards herself, with instruction from a neighbor named Gerald, a retired farmer who had lived down the road from the property for 20 years and who had never, in all that time, seen anyone at the house. He had brought her firewood the first week without being asked, and without making it a moment of pity or charity, he had simply pulled up in his truck with a load of split oak, stacked it on the porch, and said that the old house had probably been cold long enough. Margaret had thanked him with a piece of pie, and he had said it was the best pie he had eaten in 3 years, which she suspected was not strictly accurate, but appreciated regardless. The house had become something. Not yet what it would eventually become, but something. She had found a rhythm in it: the early mornings, the quiet, the way the light came through the east windows in winter. She had joined a Methodist church in town, the same denomination she had worked for in Fredericksburg for 22 years, and the women there had treated her not with the uncomfortable sympathy of people who don't know what to say, but with the practical, competent warmth of a community that has seen hard things before and knows that showing up with a casserole and a genuine interest in your well-being is more useful than almost anything else. She was not happy exactly. She was not yet past the weight of what had happened. But she was present. She was intact. And she had begun, quietly, to think about what came next. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning. She did not recognize the number. She almost did not answer it. She said later that she had been getting more calls from reporters and bloggers who had picked up pieces of her story through the court filings, and she had become cautious about unknown numbers. But something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, calm, a little hesitant, with a slight North Carolina softness in the vowels. He said, "My name is James Voss. I am trying to reach a woman named Margaret Calloway. I think she may have known my birth mother. Her name was Eleanor." James had been 62 years old that March. He had been born in Richmond, Virginia, in late 1961, and he had been raised by an adoptive family in Durham, North Carolina, where his adoptive father worked as a civil engineer and his adoptive mother taught second grade. They had been good parents. He had grown up in a house full of books and dinner table conversation and a genuine, lasting sense of being wanted. He had never lacked for love. But the question of where he had come from had been with him since adolescence. And in his late 40s, after his adoptive parents both passed away, he had begun looking in earnest. He had tried the standard routes: first the adoption registries, the state records, the genealogy databases that became available in the early 2000s. Virginia's adoption records from that era were sealed by default, and unsealing them required a court process that James had initiated and pursued for years without getting far enough to feel close. Then, in 2018, he had submitted his DNA to a consumer genealogy database. He had gotten matches to people with the last name Whitfield. And then, slowly, through the painstaking work of following names and dates and family trees across generations, he had found Eleanor. He had found her name in a Richmond City directory from the 1960s. He had found her in a church membership record. And then he had found her death notice in 2017 and had understood that he was 2 years too late to meet her. He had hired a private investigator in late 2019. The investigator had found photographs of Eleanor in her later years, a couple of distant shots taken outside the care facility, candid and unposed. James had looked at them for a very long time. He said there was no question. The face was the same face he saw in the mirror every day, with 50 years of different history written across it, but the same face. He carried those photographs everywhere. He still does. The investigator had also found the probate records for Eleanor's estate, had found Margaret's name on the deed, had found, through the public court filings, the outline of what had happened to Margaret in 2019: the fraud, the foreclosure, the move to Culpeper. And James had sat with all of this information for 2 years before he called. He had not wanted to add to whatever Margaret was carrying. He had not wanted to arrive in the middle of someone else's crisis with his own. But in March 2021, when enough time had passed that he felt he could reach out without doing more harm than good, he picked up the phone. He said, on that phone call, "I am not coming to make any claim on anything. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in the house or the property. I just wanted to know where Eleanor ended up. I just wanted to know if someone who knew her was still here to talk to." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come to Culpeper. I have 4 boxes of documents that I think belong to you as much as they belong to me." He arrived on a Saturday in early April, driving a silver sedan from Durham. He pulled into the driveway and parked and sat in the car for a moment before getting out, and Margaret watched him from the front window, and she said later that the first thing she thought was that he had Eleanor's eyes. Not the color. She did not know Eleanor's eye color from photographs, which were mostly black and white. But the expression, that particular expression of someone who has been carrying something careful and heavy for a very long time and is uncertain whether this is the moment they are permitted to put it down. She went out to the porch to meet him. They shook hands, and then, after a moment, he said, "Is it all right if?" And she said yes. And they stood in front of the gray house on the dirt road in Culpeper and held on to each other briefly, with the precision and care of two people who have just found something they did not know they had been looking for. He brought photographs of Eleanor. Margaret had never seen her smile in any of the photographs she had found in the basement boxes, but James had one taken, apparently, by a long-distance lens from outside the care facility, catching her in an unguarded moment in the garden. She was looking at something off to the left, her face slightly lifted, and she was smiling with the relaxed, private smile of a person who is not aware of being watched. Margaret looked at that photograph for a long time. She set it on the mantel, next to the photograph that had been there when she arrived, the formal, serious one of Eleanor in front of the house. The two photographs, side by side, of the same woman at two very different moments in her life. Margaret said she liked it that way. She liked the idea of Eleanor being both of those things in the same room. James Voss has no legal connection to the house in Culpeper. He has no claim on it, and he has never suggested that he should. What he has is something harder to describe legally, but perhaps more durable. He has an understanding of where he came from, and a person who shares that understanding, and a relationship that has grown, in the years since that April Saturday, into something that Margaret has described as the family she was given when she thought she had lost everything. He visits twice a year. They talk on the phone more often than that. He brought his adult daughter to meet Margaret the summer after their first meeting, and his daughter, who had the same jaw as James, and, when she smiled, something that Margaret recognized from two photographs on a mantel in Culpeper, sat in the kitchen of that house and ate the same pie that Margaret had made for Gerald on that first cold week, and they talked for 4 hours about Eleanor and about Richmond, and about the particular kind of strength that looks like silence from the outside, but is actually something much more deliberate than that. By the fall of 2022, the house in Culpeper had been renovated, not extensively, not expensively, but carefully. The porch was repaired. The interior had been repainted, the floors refinished, the kitchen updated with used appliances that Margaret had found and installed with the help of a local handyman she paid in cash and conversation, the latter of which she was told was the more valuable of the two. She had converted the second bedroom into a self-contained rental unit, a small apartment with its own entrance from the back of the house, and the rental income covered her property taxes and utilities with enough left over to feel like breathing room. She was not wealthy. She had never been wealthy. She was secure in the way that matters most. She had a place to be, and it was hers, and no one had a claim on it. She had also started writing. Not a book, at first just a blog, the kind of informal online presence that she set up in the fall of 2020 because her daughter Susan, who had eventually come around, suggested that Margaret's story might be useful to other people. The blog was about financial abuse in marriage, about what it looks like from the inside, about the specific ways that trust can be used as a tool against you when the person who holds it has decided their interests are more important than yours. She wrote about the 7-year pattern, about the Delaware LLC, about the home equity line of credit in her name that she never signed for, about the bank statement with $214. She wrote about all of it plainly, without dramatic language, in the voice of a woman who had had a long time to understand what had happened and was no longer in shock about it. The blog found its audience. By the end of 2021, it had 40,000 monthly readers. By 2022, a nonprofit that worked with financially abused women had invited her to speak at their regional conference in Richmond. By 2023, a small independent publisher had offered her a contract for a memoir. She accepted. The book was titled, she chose the title herself, The House Eleanor Left. She still drives the 2014 Honda Accord. She is not, she has said in interviews, someone who needs much. What she needed, for most of her adult life, was security. And what she has learned, the lesson that cost her 40 years and everything she thought she owned, is that security is not something another person can give you. It is something you build, or something you inherit from someone who built it in your name while you were busy trusting the wrong person to take care of it for you. Eleanor understood this. She had learned it the hard way, in 1961, in a room in Richmond, holding a child for 4 hours before she had to let go. And she had spent the rest of her life making sure someone else would not have to learn it the same way. Richard Calloway paid the last of his civil judgment in 2023. Margaret accepted it without comment. She has not spoken about him publicly in a way that could be described as bitter, which is either evidence of exceptional character or the kind of peace that comes from having moved far enough past something that it simply no longer has the weight it once had. When asked, she says only that she wishes him nothing particular. She does not wish him harm. She does not wish him well. She has moved on in the direction that Eleanor pointed her, and Richard is not in that direction. There is a question at the center of this story that I want to ask you directly before we go, and it is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that stayed with me the longest after I spent weeks with Margaret's story, reading the documents, reading Eleanor's letters, reading the court filings and the blog posts and the accounts of people who knew both women. The question is this: what does it mean to plan for someone else's disaster? Eleanor Voss did not know, in any specific or provable sense, that Margaret would end up at 68 with $214 and a foreclosure notice. She did not have access to Richard's bank records. She could not see the Delaware LLC or the home equity line of credit. What she had was a knowledge of patterns, a knowledge of how certain kinds of men operate in certain kinds of marriages, a knowledge, earned at great personal cost, of what happens to women who place all of their financial trust in someone who has decided, quietly and in advance, that their interests matter more. And she responded to that knowledge with 56 years of action paying, preserving, maintaining on behalf of a woman she barely knew, who would not understand why until she was standing in a house that had been holding its breath for 60 years. Eleanor Voss was erased from her family's story. She was cut out, written off, made invisible by a decision she had no power to prevent. Her response was not to seek recognition, not to demand justice, not to insist that the world acknowledge what had been done to her. Her response was to ensure that when the damage came again, and she believed it would, because patterns repeat, there would be something standing. A house, a deed, a sealed letter on a kitchen table. Margaret Calloway lost 40 years of assumptions in a single Tuesday morning. What she found in their place was not what she would have chosen, but it was real. It was hers, and it was built by someone who had loved her from a distance, without ever being allowed to say so, for longer than Margaret had known she existed. That is the story. That is all of it. And if you are sitting with it right now the way I sat with it, a little bit stunned, a little bit grateful, uncertain exactly where to put the feeling it leaves you with, then I think you understand why I wanted to tell it. Some stories do not resolve into a clean lesson. Some stories just ask you to sit with what a person was capable of, and what that says about the rest of us, and whether we are paying enough attention to the people in our lives who are doing quiet, patient, important things that we do not yet have the full context to understand. Eleanor understood. Margaret understands now. Maybe, having spent 90 minutes here with both of them, you do too. Before we close, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Not just scroll past it. Not just leave an automatic reaction. Really think about it. If you had been in Margaret's position on that December morning, if you had opened that banking app and seen $214.03, if the guest room bed had already been made by the time you came downstairs, if the closet was half empty and the phone was disconnected and the office had told you he had resigned 2 weeks ago, what would you have done next? Would you have driven 2 hours alone to a house you had never seen, on a deed you had just found, because a woman you barely remembered had left it to you? Or would you have stopped? Would you have gone to your sister's couch, or your son's spare room, or somewhere familiar? There is no right answer. But the answer you feel when you ask yourself that question tells you something real about how you see risk and starting over, and what it means to move towards something unknown when everything familiar has been taken away. Leave that answer in the comments. I read every one of them. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. It always means a great deal to us to know that these stories are reaching people across the country and beyond. And if you have not already done so, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for spending 90 minutes with Margaret, and with Eleanor, and with a house on a gravel road in Culpeper, Virginia, that had been waiting a very long time to be useful. These stories matter. The people in them matter. And you, for taking the time to sit with them, you matter too. We will see you next time.